This is Capital Notes from Milwaukee's NPR. I'm Ayan Silver, speaking with J.R. Ross, editor of WizPolitics.com. Hi, J.R. Thanks for joining me.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Okay, there was a big Joint Finance Committee meeting last week. That's the State Budget Review Committee. It's controlled by legislative Republicans, and the governor has already proposed his version. The state budget is pretty all-encompassing. It determines everything from aid to local governments, to funding for safety net health care, to infrastructure fixes around the state. What are the big takeaways at the moment from that hearing and where we're at with the budget?
Well, Republicans laid down their marker on taxes and education. Now, there's still, some stuff to come from the committee, like on the University of Wisconsin system, but they passed a package for K-12 education, much smaller than what Evers proposed, and they did their tax plan. Now, remember, the governor had been in negotiations with Republicans for weeks, a couple months, really, and we were kind of waiting to see what came out of that. Those talks broke down. Now, Republicans are moving ahead trying to craft a budget that they can get through their caucuses and on the governor's desk. It's going to be interesting to see how they put this thing together because their numbers are smaller than years past. They need to make their caucus happy, but also get something that Evers will sign. And the question is, with the tax cut package and the education plan, have they put together something that the governor could live with, or are they risking him vetoing the entire thing?
As you mentioned, Governor Tony Evers ultimately has the final say over it. He's got the partial veto power. He can veto words, letters, numbers, punctuation. At this point, do you think he'd sign off on the tax plan and the
Good question.
K-12? Yeah.
Now, so first off, K-12. So the governor, he proposed $3.3 billion in state aid to the Department of Public Instruction. Republican lawmakers passed $336 million. Obviously a big difference. One thing to keep in mind is that Governor Evers in the 2023-25 budget used his veto pen to extend by 4 centuries an annual increase in how much schools can spend per pupil of $225 each year. That's an increase every year. That cap applies to what districts spend between property taxes and state aid. Looking at the motion that Republicans approved, there's not a whole lot of state aid going to that formula for how much schools can spend. That would normally mean a property tax increase. Now, it's fascinating with Republicans. They have been obsessed about your property tax bill for years, especially under Scott Walker when he was governor. That was always a focus of having, a kind of a small to no increase in property taxes. They're kind of looking at it this way. One, they could still come in and do other things in the budget that would impact what that property tax bill would look like. But two, they seem to be banking on the idea that if things stay as is and there are no other changes, that voters will blame Governor Evers for their property tax bill going up because Evers is the one who did that 400-year veto. He set that annual increase going forward. They seem to be saying, okay, this is going to be the governor's problem. So there's that one piece to it. Number two, the tax plan, the governor has vetoed a retirement income break before, expansion of the income covered by a tax bracket. He's done that before. Now, though, he's getting closer to a possible reelection bid. So would he veto this again with reelection in mind? There's all kinds of dynamics to that. The governor, he has said he won't announce or make a decision about a third term or running for a third term until after the budget is done. But you got to wonder, would this factor into his decision about what to do? Because, people kind of like tax cuts sometimes. So it'll be interesting to see how he approaches this discussion with November of 26 looming in the background.
You've mentioned, obviously, K through 12 funding was a big conversation last week. Public schools get a per student funding from the state. That's depending on how many students they have. And it hasn't kept pace with inflation. So that's really led many school districts to go to referendum. And you've been talking about the property tax increases and that kind of thing. How likely is it that we'll see an increase in per student funding in this year's budget?
Well, right now, none. So remember, it's already baked in. Because the governor issued that veto in 2023, you have that automatic increase every year of $325 per student, what you can spend. Again, spend between property taxes and state aid. So that's going up. The question has kind of been, how much state aid Republicans put into that formula to hold down the property tax hit. Right now, they're not putting much in. And I don't want to diminish $336 million. That's more than I got in the bank, right? But in the grand scheme of the school funding for education, it's not a lot of money. So you're talking about, I think they quoted like $1 billion more overall for schools to spend, but 2/3 of that would come off your property tax bill. So it's kind of the approach to funding schools that they're looking at right now.
And can you define, we've been using some terms, there's property taxes, there's referendums. What I want you to lay out is how it all works, just a basic primer on the property taxes, referendum, and state aid, how those all work differently in terms of getting funding to schools.
So back in the 90s, the state implemented a system where districts were kind of locked in what they were spending per student, and it varies from district to district. They were locked in, but then the state committed to basically funding 2/3 of education. What they did, though, is say, okay, we're going to take what you're spending right now. We're going to kind of put that as their benchmark. Then we'll give you an increase each year, how much you spend between property taxes and state aid. And on average, the state will cover 2/3 of that cost. Now, over the years, we've had good and bad years in Wisconsin, right, for state revenues. So we've not always hit that 2/3 mark. And there are other things that have kind of been pulled away over the years. It used to be a three-legged stool. You had the revenue limits on how much you spend per student, called the qualified economic offer. It said to districts, if you offer teachers this much of an increase in salary and benefits, they can't go to arbitration. But that's locked in. And that kind of like kept salaries at a certain pace for a long time. So that's the background. Now, fast forward to Republican years. Under Scott Walker, they put state aid into the formula often. They didn't always give an increase in the spending per pupil on an annual basis. That meant that the state money put into the formula mostly drove down property taxes rather than increasing overall spend. Now with this new setup we have with the Evers veto, you're getting an increase every year for now for 4 centuries. $325 per kid. The question becomes in how much state aid goes into the formula, because again, the more state money you put into K-12, the less districts raise from taxes. If you don't put a lot more money in, they raise even more from property taxes. That's where we're at right now. With this motion that Republicans passed, you're going to see a big kind of hit for property taxpayers. Now, there's still time. There are other pieces of the property tax bill. You got counties, cities, tech colleges, right? You could also do other things that impact that. So Republicans may have other property tax proposals to come. But as you sit here right now, most of the money that schools would get to spend, new money to spend, would come from property taxes, not from state aid for the 25-27 biennium.
You're tuned into Capitol Notes. I'm WEWM's Maayan Silver, speaking with J.R. Ross, editor of WisPolitics.com. Okay, another area of K through 12 quizzical questions that I had for you this week is the special education reimbursement. Mm-hmm. So local schools have a mandate to provide services for students with special needs, but the funding they get from the state doesn't come close to covering the total cost of special education. It's been a really hot topic this year. What's the latest on that?
And that's interesting because Republicans chose to put most of that new state money into K-12 into the special education programs. So right now, if you're a district and you have special needs kids, you get reimbursed for your costs. You don't get reimbursed for everything. The rate's about just north of 32% right now. Governor Evers wanted to take that to 60% to get there, and that's the main program. To get there, it costs more than $1.1 billion. There's then a second program, high cost special education. These are kids that it's $30,000 in cost per kid in a year. Much more demands. Smaller pot of money, small number of kids, and we're also not reimbursing 100% of that. Republicans have gone above the current spending reimbursement rate. Actually, for the high cost program, they want to reimburse more than what Evers proposed. But that main program, the main special education pot, They're about 37, 38%, right in the middle there somewhere, for reimbursement compared to the 60 that Evers wanted. The thing to keep in mind, though, is we have a lot of cash on hand in Wisconsin right now. The surplus is going to be $4.3 billion at the end of this fiscal year, June 30th, but that's one-time money. And a concern from Republicans is the more you spend or put into tax cuts, the more you're committing to future. It's called future commitments. So that means in the next budget, which I know is 2 years from now, 2027, hopefully we'll all still be here. If you use that one-time money to cut taxes or pay for ongoing programs, you create a hole in the next budget. You have to have revenue growth, tax increases, or spending cuts to make things balance, right? So let's say you take that $4 billion in surplus, put it all in education. Well, you're a lot likely to grow $4 billion in the next budget. So where do you find the money, right, to keep spending at that level? That's what I'm getting at. There's a challenge here and people think we got all this money to spend, which we do. But if you spend it for ongoing commitments, you create a problem for yourself long term. Republicans are trying to find a way to find a sweet spot for their caucuses where they put just enough in their taxes to make some people happy. That's your $1.3 billion without creating so much of a commitment going forward that in 2027 we go, oh man, we're in trouble. We've got all these costs to go cover and we don't have the money anymore.
Very interesting. It does seem like a conundrum. So Joint Finance is tomorrow taking up other topics, specifically corrections and the UW system funding. What can you preview for us about that?
Now, remember, Governor Evers was negotiating with Republican lawmakers for a couple months on the budget. The going thought was if the governor had been able to reach a deal with Republican lawmakers, then UW probably would have gotten something okay. I'm not saying $855 million like they asked for, but more than zero. Now those talks have broken off, there's a lot of speculation of, well, what's going to happen to UW? Because remember, Republican lawmakers are still pretty hot at UW over diversity, equity, and inclusion. They feel like the system is still too immersed in that. They don't like it. So the question becomes, will they get cut? And if they get cut, how much? I mean, if they ask for $855 billion more, that's not going to happen. Could they actually get cut from current levels? With corrections, the big question is, how much of what Evers wanted to do to revamp the system will Republicans agree to? There seems to be a consensus that the prison in Green Bay should be closed. It dates back to the 1800s. It's locals want to get rid of it so they can open that land for development. It's not very safe or easy to manage. So a new facility would make sense to some people. The governor didn't include a new facility in his proposal. He wants to close Green Bay, rearrange a bunch of other stuff with the system, and reduce the number of beds like around 700 or 900 beds that we have right now. Republicans want to close Green Bay. They don't want to reduce the number of beds we have in the prison system. They are talking more about building a new prison somewhere in Green Bay. Can they reach an agreement on that? That's what I'm watching there is what's the system going to look like after, and will Evers agree to a new prison if Republicans go that route? Remember, Evers ran in 2018 promising to try and address our prison population. We incarcerate more people than other states do on a per capita basis. There are some that argue there should be alternatives to imprisonment, new approaches to our system. Can they reach an agreement? Will the governor be happy with what they do to his plan when he signed into law?
All right. Well, thanks so much for the insights, JR, and thanks for joining me on Capital Notes.
Anytime.
That was J.R. Ross, editor of WisPolitics.com, speaking with me, WUWM's Maayan Silver. Listen for our segments every other Monday with an extended segment on lake effect, and check out the Capital Notes podcast wherever you get your podcasts.